Okay, so thanks very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here and for arranging this event as well. So today I'm going to talk about interpretable machine learning for materials design and characterization. So I'll start off by actually giving you a quick introduction to the SciML group and who we are and what we do. Then I'll talk a little bit about some thoughts about why I think interpretable machine learning is particularly important in scientific applications. And then I'll go through some different interpretation methods that you use depending on the machine learning approaches that you're using. Then I'll actually go through some examples of studies that we've done recently where we've been kind of digging into the black box of machine learning models to actually understand what's happening inside them, and hopefully show you how this is bringing a lot of added value to the work that we're doing and helping us to do better science. I'll wrap up then with a few thoughts on how interpretable machine learning is important for the future of scientific machine learning. But first of all, a little bit about our group and what we do and where we're based. So we're based at the Rutherford Appleton laboratory, which is in Didcot, just out to the west of London. So I'm sure many of you will know Rutherford Appleton Laboratory and be aware of the facilities that we have there. Things like diamond light source, ISIS neutron and muon source, central laser facility, and so on. We also have the particle physics data from CERN. The UK's part of that is based at Rutherford Laboratory, and environmental data at Jasmine. And it's a site that's really awash with data. And so just as an example here, I have that a single tomographic experiment that's done nowadays at Diamond can produce up to 100 terabytes of data just from a couple of days of doing experiment. So that's the kind of data that means that you can't kind of treat it the way you used to, you know, take it away with you, go back, analyze it at your leisure. We really need to think differently about how we do this. So I did a quick check, and I think it would take, if anyone remembers what DVDs are, it takes about 20,000 DVDs to store that 100 terabytes of data. So obviously the kind of idea of moving data around like that is not possible anymore. So the idea is that machine learning is going to be critical for the future of these facilities. And what's more, the capacity of the facilities to produce data is only increasing, and actually increasing quicker than Moore's law. So we really need to think about the kind of algorithms and approaches that we use for treating this data. And that's the kind of raison d'etre of the scientific machine learning team is to how can we do new science by combining machine learning and data collected at these facilities. So a little bit about why in particular interpretable machine learning is important. So I think it's important in many scenarios, interpretable machine learning, but of course in the context of machine learning for science, I think it's particularly important because, you know, if you're coming up with a machine learning algorithm to suggest what advert should pop up next at this side of the article I'm reading, you may not really care why it's suggesting them. You may just care about that it chooses the right one and the results look good. But when you're working on scientific problems, people tend to want to know why as well as just the answer that you get. And quite aside from that, it also brings value to the machine learning models themselves in a number of different scenarios. So if we have models and if we have models that underperform, so I'll actually have an example of some cases of this later on, you can use interpretable machine learning to actually diagnose what's going wrong and work out the limitations of your model, which is critical. So you'll know where you can apply it in future, where you can trust it in future. When models are actually matching, let's say, human performance or the level of performance that you would hope that they would achieve, then if the results are interpretable, then it becomes much easier to trust. I mean, people like if they can understand why a result has been given. So it becomes much easier to trust the models. And the kind of dream and where we'd really like to go is if you actually have models that are achieving results, let's say picking up, able to distinguish things that were undistinguishable before the machine learning model was applied, well, then if we can dig down and see why the machine learning model actually did this, what was it in the data that allowed it to perform this well, we could possibly learn new physics by actually looking into the machine learning model. So I think that's the real goal for some of this. I'll be able to show you examples of the first two, but hopefully the third one is something that we're working towards and something we'll hopefully achieve at some point. So I said at the start that you use different types of interpretability and different interpretability tools depending on the machine learning models that you use. And I kind of broadly split this into two classes, and I will give examples where we're doing this in both of these classes. So we can think about what we call classical machine learning models. So that's anything from kind of linear regression through things like support vector machines, decision trees, etc. And then on the other side, we can think about deep methods. So deep neural networks, basic neural networks of any flavor are what I'm going to call deep methods. And depending on which of these scenarios you're in, which you're using to build your model, you will use different interpretability tools. And I'll start off by going through what we use, or an example of some work we've done with classical machine learning. And then after that, I'll move on to a couple of examples where we're actually working with deep neural networks. So just to kind of outline what I mean by classical machine learning and the kind of scenarios where you might use it. So in classical machine learning, you tend to have some kind of set of handcrafted descriptors or features that you feed to your model. So in this equation, the f of x equals y, your x are some set of features that you've chosen to represent your data. And you often spend a long time engineering those features, and it often requires a lot of good domain knowledge. So the example I show here on the right is from a study that we did with Dan Davies, who's based at UCL a couple of years ago. And this is predicting band gaps of materials based on their properties. And you can see the kind of the descriptors that went into the model are things that, you know, are domain expert kind of descriptions of a material. So covalent radius and electronegativity and stuff like that. And typically these types of classical machine learning approaches would be applied in scenarios where you have less data and your data is very well structured. So it's structured in the sense of you have to hand all of these kind of descriptors that you can use to try and train your model. This is by no means exclusive to this, but typically it'll be in tens of thousands of training points when you're doing this type of classical machine learning. So the example I'm going to show of this is some work that I've been doing with the group of Professor Aaron Walsh at Imperial College, and particularly this is led by Kazuke Morita, who's a PhD student there. And this is work where we're building models to predict dielectric constants. So in particular, we're interested in the high frequency dielectric constant. So this is of fundamental importance. It's something that's related to the chemical and the electronic structure of materials and of molecules. And it's of fundamental scientific interest and has been studied for well over 100 years. Also functional importance for a lot of kind of anything where the optics of a material are important. So LEDs, optical fibers, etc. It's important that you're able to know dielectric constants. But when you want to calculate this from first principles, it's actually a relatively expensive calculation to do. So the idea here was initially we started off by thinking, well, first of all, can we just build some machine learning models which can work as surrogate models and can predict a dielectric constant much more quickly than a first principles method, but with similar fidelity to a first principles method. And so that's where we start. And Kazuke did work on looking at a number of different approaches and found that he could indeed train some models that do a pretty good job of predicting the dielectric constant of materials. So we're looking at solids here. And the one that he came down on at the end as working the best from the classical models was support vector regression. And of course, it works an incredible amount quicker than the density functional theory. So you can do these predictions really quickly. But once we got this, then we wanted to know, can we actually extract more information from this? Can we learn about the physical inputs that are responsible for the results that you're getting? And also, you can see, I'm sure, on the plot here, there are definitely outlier cases where the model fails very badly. And we'd like to know, well, can we understand why it is that the model has failed in those cases? And so this is a classical method. So one thing that you can do is you can look at feature importances. And again, I'm jumping back to our paper from 2019 on band gaps here, where we presented something on feature importances. So in that case, you had a decision tree that was the model, but works equally for support vector regression. You can get these plots of just what has contributed the most to the actual final result. And that's quite nice. It tells you something about what are the important physical properties. But there are a couple of limitations. So one of them is it doesn't really tell you very much about interplay between different features. So you can have correlation between your features. This doesn't really tell you anything about that. And it's also what we call, when we're talking about interpretability in machine learning, this is a global explanation. So it explains overall what's important for the model, but we might be interested in local explanations, which is in an individual given case, what was it that was important for this? So let's take our outliers in the previous plot. Can we take those and work out what were the important factors in that particular pathological case? And so to do this, we turn to a method that's based in game theory, and it's something called Shapley values. So they're named after their creator, who's Lloyd Shapley, and he published this method, a value for n-person games, and this was published back in the 1950s. And it's an approach to explainability that allows you to treat features as if they're coalitions playing a game. So effectively, you treat your features as, let's say, players or moves that take place in a game, and then you have some final result at the end, and you look at how those players worked together to achieve that final result. So I'll actually just go into a little bit more detail about how Shapley values work. So this is just a kind of simple illustrative example, and one that many people will be familiar with. So let's say Alice, Bob, and Celine go out for a meal, and the bill comes to £90. And during the meal, they've got some fries, they've got some sides. This is pre-COVID, obviously, so they've been sharing everything, sharing a bottle of wine, and they want to work out who should pay what for this meal. And obviously could go Dutch, make everything simple, but they've decided they want to work out in a fair and principled way. I mean, these are fun people to go for dinner with. They want to work out in a fair and principled way who should pay what for the meal. And so what you can do is if we have some kind of model for how people spend on the meals on their own or in separate coalitions, then we can look at those kind of things beforehand. So we have our model here, which is V of C, which tells us, given the participants in order C, how much the bill would have been. So going from the top here, we can see that, well, if Alice had eaten alone, the model tells us that Alice would have spent £80 on the meal. If Bob had eaten alone, £56, Celine alone would have been £70. And then we can start to look at coalitions of them. So if Alice had turned up first and then Bob had come and joined her and Alice and Bob had the meal together, then it would have been £80 again. And look at all these different combinations. And we know, of course, that it was £90 for all of them. So then what we do is we start looking at the order in which they appear for the meal. So you can take a look at, so if we have Alice, then Bob comes along, then Celine. So you have Alice, that was 80. Alice and Bob, that's also 80. So 0 is Bob's contribution to that. And then the remainder is 10, which goes on Celine. And you look at all the different possible orderings that people could have turned up in and work out how much they would have contributed to the bill in that instance. and then simply take the average over all of those. And then we come up with these numbers. So we find that Alice pays £39.20, Bob pays £20.70, and Celine pays £30.20. And that's a fair and principled way to work out how much the contributions of each of these individuals is. And it's something that you can also use, for example, in scenarios like, let's say there's a company that makes a certain amount of profit, and in that company there's someone who works in the factory producing the product, there's a designer, and there's a salesperson, and you want to work out how you should split the profit between them. You can then do things like look at the order in which they turn up. So let's say you had the salesperson turned up before the producer or the designer. Well, then obviously there's no product, so there's less profit in that scenario. And then by doing that, you can work out how the profit should be shared amongst people. So that's what we've done with our model for dielectric constants. And effectively what we're doing is we're saying, how does the dielectric constant change as each of these different factors in the model are added into the model? And by doing that, we can see how much they contribute to a particular instance. So you can see this plot on the right-hand side. So this gives you the contributions. So the Shapley value is based on the x-axis down here at the bottom. So if it's to the left of 0, then that property is contributing to suppressing the final value or reducing the dielectric constant. If it's to the right, then that property is contributing to increasing the dielectric constant. And also we can color in, so the dots represent each of the different materials that we've done the calculation for. And we can color in the dots based on whether that, so if the dot is pink up here at the top, it means that the material had a high density. If it's blue, it means it has a low density. And you can start to see very clear trends emerging from this. So you've got your local explanations for each of the dots, but you can also start to see global explanations by looking at it from a higher level. So you can see that obviously when materials density is high, then the Shapley value is high, which means that that's contributing more to the dielectric constant. So you'd expect higher dielectric constants in materials with higher density. The opposite would be true for the amount of oxygen that's in the material. And what's quite neat then is you can also start to look at interplay of different contributions. So in this plot here, we've got the contribution of the band gap to the Shapley value on the left. So you can see that at low band gap, you get a positive contribution, whereas at higher band gap, you get a negative contribution towards the final dielectric constant. And we can also color this in by material density. So you can kind of see that the low density is kind of suppressing the effect then at either end of either part of this this plot here. And it's really neat because then we can actually go and compare this to the kind of classical models that exist, analytical models for dielectric constants. So the example I give here is the Penn model. And you see a very similar functional relationship. So we've got some kind of inverse power law for the band gap, how the band gap contributes to, well, in this case, it's the Shapley value, but it's kind of a proxy for how it's contributing to the dielectric constant. And you see, you have the similar kind of behavior in the Penn model. And then, as I said, we can also use these to look at individual cases and work out why something has actually failed, or why the model isn't working so well. So we take this pathology here, which is a point that's a massive outlier. So this is lithium boron carbide, and on the right here we have a waterfall plot of the various contributions to the dielectric constant, so the Shapley values. And you kind of see, you start from the average value overall for the whole set, and you see how these different things make this lithium boron carbide deviate. So when it's blue, it means it's reducing it further down. Red means it's moving it up. And you can see at the end here, it's the materials density that really pulls it really far down. So that's the overwhelming contribution to this poor prediction. And if we actually go back and look at the distribution of our data set, we can see that the we see the region of space where lithium boron carbide is. It's actually a very low density, and it's not a well represented area within our training set. So it means that things with low density like that, you may not want to trust the predictions that the model is making in those cases. Okay, so that was a bit about using classical machine learning and interpretability. So let's take a look at deep learning. So in this case, I said I mean things like deep neural networks, and the core difference here is that the input data that you give to deep methods tends to be a lot less structured. So where we had kind of domain expert labels for classical methods, here we feed it something like an image or an audio file or something like that, you know, or text, which is not very structured. And actually what happens is in deep methods, the neural network actually learns the features itself, as well as doing a function approximation like the classical methods. It also learns some kind of representation. So if we think about things like convolutional neural networks, where we have convolutional filters, and these are for looking at images. So what these convolutional filters are doing in effect is actually compressing down the original image and learning the salient features in that image. So they're learning a representation. So now you've got your original image, which is this theta here, and you've got some kind of function of that. That's your representation learning. And then the final value is a function of that function of theta. And this tends to require much larger data sets, so thousands to tens of thousands, but you can then work on much less structured data. So actually, I've kind of described a little bit what I meant by representation learning there, and in the interest of time, I'll skip over going into too much detail about representation learning. But effectively, representation learning is this compressing down of the original data and picking out salient features before you go into some kind of function approximation. And the example I'm going to show you, the first one I'm going to show you here, is where we're learning an interpretable model for identifying magnetic Hamiltonians of materials based on inelastic neutron scattering data. So the material we take here is PCSMO, which is half-doped double perovskite. And it's got a couple of possible magnetic structures on the manganese sublattice there, and so I should say that this is something that was solved previously by inelastic neutron scattering, and working with our collaborators at ISIS, Toby and Duck, we decided to see if we could train machine learning models to do it, and if they would do it for the same reasons that were originally identified. And so your inelastic neutron scattering data is something like this in the middle here. It's a three-dimensional data. So you've got reciprocal lattice vectors and then energy. And we want to work out from that what is the magnetic Hamiltonian. So the first thing we did is, well, first of all, can we train a neural network to get that? So given that data, can we train a neural network which will give the correct answer? So what we did is we actually used simulated data. And we used about 12,000 points of simulated data and trained a model. And it indeed was able to do this classification with 96% accuracy on the test set. And also when we present it with the actual experimental data, it predicts the correct model, or the model which was identified by trained physicists. But then we want to say, okay, so it's making the correct prediction, but why is it making this correct prediction? So I should say that we're feeding in the data to this as kind of flattened two-dimensional images of that three-dimensional spectrum. So kind of taking slices through and feeding those slices into the model. So it's like an image recognition type model. And so we've taken an approach which has been developed for interpreting convolutional neural networks in image recognition. And it's something called class activation maps. And effectively what this does is it takes a given example, you pass it to the network and it makes a classification, but then you ask the question, what parts of the original image were important for making that classification. And we see here that it's classified barbell in all of these. And then you ask it, this map underneath is showing the areas that were important for it classifying as barbell. The way this actually works is, this is about digging down inside the neural network to understand how it's working. So what happens in this case is you have your trained model, and the weights and everything are fixed, and you pass it the example that you're interested in. And it goes through the neural network, and it rather than feeding it into this final layer where you get your prediction, we actually kind of intercept it some way through the model where it's gone through the representation learning, and the neural network has picked out salient features. So then we take these convolutional filters here. So the convolutional filters just look like little maps. They're just matrices of pixels. And then we multiply that convolutional filter by the weight that it has for whatever classification it made. So if it's barbell, then we multiply by the weight that contributes to that final classification. You take the average across all of these different filters at the end, and then you project it back up to the original image size, and you get some kind of map that maps back onto your original image. And then we do that with the experimental data that we have. So the experimental data here is on the left. We feed it through the model, it makes the classification, then we ask which parts were important. And you can see it's identified a couple of slices here in red and orange that are particularly important for the final classification. And what's really, really nice about that is these were actually the exact same regions of the spectrum that were identified by trained physicists in the first place as being important for that classification. And the nice thing is that actual classification and finding that region of the spectrum in the first place is something that actually took in total several years to do. I mean, this is the kind of thing where you can at least get a thesis chapter based on the interpretation of one of these experiments. It's so kind of involved and complex. Whereas when we use our convolutional network and class activation maps, and this includes generating the simulated data and everything, it took about 1 week to do the interpretation. And effectively what it does is it takes the data, which is in this kind of big space of data here, and it narrows it down and tells you, these are the important parts of the data that you want to look at. And these are important for determining or for distinguishing between the different magnetic Hamiltonians that you're interested in. So that was quite neat. So I'll go on to a final quick example, which is some work we've been doing with a company called Finden, who are based at Harwell. And this was actually very generously funded by AI3SD. So this is to do with machine learning for tomography. And we've been developing this package for machine learning for tomography, which can do a number of different things and, you know, makes it relatively easy, even if you don't have necessarily machine learning experience. You just know a bit of Python, you should be able to pick it up and do things like doing image reconstruction or image cleaning, segmentation, super resolution on your tomographic data. So what we were interested in is actually super resolution. And I'm just going to quickly show you, just because this movie is very cool. This is an example of X-ray diffraction CT that was done by Finden beforehand. So with X-ray diffraction CT, can I get the movie to play again? You get chemical information. So usually when you see tomography scans, it's usually absorption, which doesn't give you much information about the chemistry, but diffraction gives you actual information about the chemistry. And this example here is a catalyst bed where they're able to work out where the different components are in this three-dimensional map of the catalyst. Now, the thing about XRD CT is that it's actually, it takes a long time to get good resolution data. So you have to do a lot of time in your experiment. Whereas with absorption CT, you can actually get very good resolution much quicker, but obviously you don't get that chemical information. So we're working on a super resolution approach where you basically take information from both of those. So you have your XRD CT, which has rich chemical information, and your absorption CT, which has rich kind of spatial resolution, combine them and get super resolution in your CT. And we were using convolutional networks to do this. And basically what we realized is the convolutional networks can do things like this really well, but we found that there's a huge bias based on what you've trained the model on. So the example, what I'm showing here is basically you've got your ground truth. So this is what you would expect should come out of the model. Back projection, this is based on a proper physics algorithm. And then we've got the various convolutional network outputs. And what you find is that if the ground truth is battery and then you want to predict battery, the CNN works really well. But if the ground truth is battery and you've trained your model on, let's say, the catalyst bed, it performs absolutely terribly. So you've got a clear bias based on your training data here. And this means that you can't necessarily trust your model. Now, if you take the same convolutional network and train it with a balanced data set, it actually works really nicely across all of the different scenarios. So this is great. So you can actually build transferable CNNs for doing this. But the problem is then becomes, how do I know in advance if the example that I want to do this super resolution or this reconstruction with actually belongs to the same region of data as the data set that I've trained it on? So we've taken something from an approach called manifold learning here, which again kind of relies on representation learning. So we take the features of these filters here, but we actually project them down into an even lower dimensional space. So we use a method called tsna, which you can use to project a distribution from a high dimensional space to a low dimensional space. And what it tries to do is basically maintain similarities between points within that transformation. And essentially what that lets us do is to come up with these kinds of maps. So these maps, you can see very clear clusters forming. So if you put one of your examples into the neural network, you can then see where it falls on this map. And essentially what you find is these clusters, similar things start clustering together. So similar examples cluster together in this, and you can see the pictures here. And effectively what this allows you to do is in advance be able to tell whether a particular sample is actually close to the training samples for that convolutional network before you flow it through, or even if you don't have any knowledge about whether it sits close to it or not. And that means that you can actually, with confidence then, or you can say, no, this doesn't sit on the manifold, this doesn't sit close enough to my training data, so I can't trust the results of this. I'm going to have to go and retrain my model and find some data that is closer to that. Okay, so just a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up with what I see as some of the challenges and future opportunities for using interpretable machine learning and these kind of approaches of digging inside and understanding the models. So I think where we're at now is, I think with AI and material sciences, there's a lot of really interesting work around self-driving laboratories and that kind of thing. I think that's really at the cutting edge. And there's a very nice review here in Cell that I've taken this picture from. And that's kind of where we are now. I'd say that's the cutting edge at the moment. Where I'd really like to see us starting to go, and where I think we can start to go as we dig into the models and understand them more, is doing things like hypothesis generation and testing. So using approaches like probabilistic machine learning and approaches like do calculus. So this is based on a lot of the work of Judea Pearl, which there's a kind of popular science book about cause and effect and how that fits in with data science and machine learning, which is really inspiring. And I think something that we can start to think about doing now as we understand the models more. And then finally from that, really what the dream is automated discovery of new phenomena and automated discovery of new physical relationships and so on. And if we have scenarios where we've got experimental facilities, be they local ones or large scale national ones like at RAL, where we've got AI at the edge linked with databases and interpretable machine learning models exploring new physics. So I'll skip over the summary in the interest of time. More important that I should thank people who are involved with this. So I'd like to thank people who collaborated. So from Imperial and UCL, Kazuki, Dan and Aaron, people at Finden, Anthony, Hongyang, Steve and Simon, who did a lot of work on the tomography stuff, Duck and Toby at ISIS, all of the scientific machine learning team that I work with. Funding, we Innovate UK, Alan Turing Institute, and obviously AI3SD, who funded that tomography work at the end. And finally, just thank you all for your attention and wish you very happy holidays.